Christmas dinner is supposed to be warm. Candles. Laughter. Family gathered around one table pretending everything is fine. But that night I watched my father stand up, point at my grandfather, and scream, "Get out." The room went silent. Then my dad pulled a wrinkled $10 bill from his wallet and tossed it onto the table like it was trash. "Take this," he said coldly. "You're a burden." Everyone stared. No one stopped him. No one defended my grandfather. They whispered that he was poor, useless, someone who had nothing left to offer. I sat there, frozen, my hands shaking beneath the table, realizing something terrifying. This wasn't just a family argument. This was a test of who we really were when we thought no one had power, and what none of them knew was that the man they were humiliating owned the hotel they were about to stay in for Christmas. That dinner didn't just ruin our holiday, it exposed everything. My name is Harper Miller, and growing up in my family taught me one lesson early on: silence keeps things calm. I learned how to read the room before I learned how to speak my mind. I learned when to smile, when to nod, and most importantly, when to say nothing at all. In my parents' house, being easy meant being invisible. And for years, I was very good at that. But my grandfather, Walter Collins, never asked me to disappear. Grandpa Walter lived quietly, in a small house at the edge of town. The kind of house my parents liked to describe as depressing whenever his name came up. Old wooden floors that creaked when you walked, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle, a kitchen clock that ticked too loudly in the evenings. To them, it was proof that he had failed at life. To me, it felt like the only place where I could breathe. Every morning, Grandpa brewed strong black coffee and sat by the window, reading the newspaper from start to finish. He wore the same brown coat every winter, the sleeves slightly frayed at the cuffs. When something broke, he fixed it himself instead of replacing it. When something worked, he didn't see a reason to change it. "He's so stubborn," my father liked to say. "He refuses to move forward," my mother added. But when I stayed with Grandpa, nothing felt stuck. Time felt slower, kinder. When I was a child, he used to walk me to school. He never rushed me, even when I dragged my feet. He asked real questions: how I felt about my friends, what scared me, what made me happy. When I cried, he didn't tell me to toughen up. He listened. As I grew older, I began noticing things I couldn't unsee. My parents talked about Grandpa far more than they talked to him. They talked about his finances, about his lack of planning, about how he should have made better choices when he was younger. Those conversations almost always happened right before someone needed something from him. Advice, a signature, access to documents they never explained clearly. Grandpa never confronted them. He smiled politely. He nodded. He stayed quiet. By the time I was in my 20s, the pattern was impossible to ignore. My father, Richard Miller, cared deeply about appearances. He worked hard, talked loudly, and measured success in numbers, salaries, property values, vacations. My mother, Elaine, believed in politeness over honesty. She could smile through discomfort and make it look like grace. Together, they created a household where conflict wasn't solved, it was buried. I moved to Chicago after college, built a career, and learned how to stand on my own. My parents called occasionally, usually around holidays or family events. Conversations stayed shallow, safe. Grandpa called for different reasons. He asked if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping well, if I felt lonely. That December, a week before Christmas, I called him to confirm dinner plans. "Dad's hosting this year," I said. "Christmas Eve dinner." There was a pause on the line. Not static, not confusion, hesitation. "Are you sure he wants me there?" Grandpa asked gently. The question caught me off guard. I stared out the window of my apartment, watching snow gather on the fire escape. "Of course," I replied too quickly. "Your family." Another pause. "I don't want to make things uncomfortable," he said. "I know your father. He gets frustrated. I don't want to be a burden." The word hit me hard. "A burden?" I repeated. "You're not a burden. You're my grandfather." He let out a small laugh, the kind people use to soften something painful. "All right, sweetheart," he said. "If you want me there, I'll come." After we hung up, I sat there holding my phone long after the screen went dark. Why would he even ask that? The answer made my chest tighten. Because somewhere along the way, My family had made him feel like he needed permission to exist. In the days leading up to Christmas, I noticed how little Grandpa was mentioned. My parents discussed the menu, the guest list, the wine. My Uncle Mark and Aunt Susan texted about schedules. My cousins shared photos of decorations and gifts. No one asked about Grandpa's health. No one asked how he'd get there. No one asked if he needed anything. When I brought him up casually, the responses were always brief. He'll manage. He's used to simple things. He doesn't need much. That sentence, "he doesn't need much," echoed in my head. The day before Christmas, I packed my bags and drove back home. Snow lined the roads, and Christmas lights flickered in windows as I passed through familiar neighborhoods. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. Families were complicated. Holidays were stressful. Not everything had to mean something. But deep down, a quiet unease settled in my stomach. I wasn't afraid of an argument. I wasn't afraid of raised voices. I was afraid of watching my grandfather sit at a table full of people and feel completely alone. And I was afraid that when that moment came, I wouldn't be able to stay silent anymore. Christmas Eve arrived, wrapped in snow and forced cheer. When I stepped into my parents' house, the warmth hit me first. The heat, the lights, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon. Christmas music played softly in the background, the kind meant to suggest comfort, tradition, family. But the warmth didn't last. My father, Richard, greeted me with a quick hug, already distracted by something on his phone. My mother, Elaine, smiled tightly and reminded me to put my coat away properly. Around the living room, relatives were already gathered: my Uncle Mark, my Aunt Susan, and my cousins chatting loudly, laughing a little too hard. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt wrong. Grandpa arrived a few minutes after I did. He stood quietly in the doorway, holding his old coat over one arm, his shoulders slightly hunched from the cold. No one rushed to greet him. No one stood up. I crossed the room immediately. "Grandpa," I said, hugging him. His coat smelled faintly of winter air and coffee. "You made it," I added, trying to sound cheerful. "I wouldn't miss it," he replied, smiling softly. Behind us, my father cleared his throat. "Well," Dad said, glancing at Grandpa briefly, "let's sit down before the food gets cold." That was it. No hug, no welcome. At the dining table, seats had already been arranged. Grandpa's chair was at the far end, slightly separated, next to the serving counter. I noticed it immediately. I chose the seat beside him. As everyone settled in, conversations picked up: work updates, travel plans, complaints about traffic and prices. The wine flowed freely. Glasses clinked. Grandpa listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was gentle. "This smells wonderful," he said at one point, nodding toward the turkey. My mother smiled politely. "Yes, well, we ordered it this year. Easier that way." The implication lingered in the air. "We didn't cook for you." As plates were passed around, Grandpa waited patiently, hands folded, never reaching across the table. When he finally received his plate, it was smaller than everyone else's. I noticed. I wasn't sure if anyone else did. Uncle Mark leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. "So, Dad," he said casually, "still living out there by yourself?" Grandpa nodded. "Yes. That can't be easy," Mark continued. "Especially these days." "I'm doing fine," Grandpa replied. Mark chuckled. "You've always said that." My cousins laughed softly, not quite sure why, but eager to join in. I felt my jaw tighten. Conversation shifted again to holiday plans. My father proudly announced that we'd be spending Christmas weekend at a luxury hotel downtown. "Finally treating ourselves," Dad said, raising his glass. "We deserve it," everyone murmured in agreement. Grandpa looked up. "That sounds nice." There was a pause. Dad glanced at him, then away. "Yes, very nice." No invitation followed. No clarification. Grandpa didn't ask. As dinner went on, the comments became sharper but still wrapped in smiles. Susan mentioned rising costs. "Everything's so expensive now. You really need to plan ahead," she said, looking pointedly at Grandpa. Elaine nodded. "Exactly. It's important to be responsible." Grandpa smiled faintly. "I've always managed." My father sighed, setting his fork down. "Managing isn't the same as planning, Dad." The table grew quiet. I looked at my father, waiting for him to soften the comment. He didn't. Instead, he leaned back and added, At some point, people need to accept help, or at least not make things harder for everyone else. The words hung heavy in the air. Grandpa's smile faltered for just a second. I don't ask for much, he said carefully. No, Dad replied. You don't ask, but you take up space. I froze. My mother glanced around quickly, as if checking who might hear, then said lightly, Richard, it's Christmas. He waved her off. I'm just being honest. I felt heat rise in my chest. Dad, I said quietly. That's enough. He turned to me, irritation flashing across his face. Stay out of this, Harper. Grandpa placed a hand gently on my arm under the table. It's fine, he whispered. But it wasn't. By the time dessert was served, the tension had settled into something thick and suffocating. Grandpa ate slowly, carefully, as if trying not to draw attention to himself. When he finished, he folded his napkin neatly and waited. No one asked if he wanted coffee. No one asked if he was tired. No one asked if he was okay. At some point, my father stood up to refill his wine. He glanced down at Grandpa and said, almost to himself, You know, some people don't realize when they've outlived their usefulness. The room went still. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. Grandpa looked up at him, confusion clouding his eyes. I'm sorry? He asked. That was the moment I knew. This dinner wasn't about food. It wasn't about Christmas. It was about power, and my family thought my grandfather had none. And as my father straightened, his expression hardening, I realized the worst part wasn't what he was about to say next. It was that everyone at the table was already preparing to let it happen. For a few seconds after my father spoke, no one moved. The ticking of the kitchen clock suddenly felt too loud. The soft Christmas music playing in the background sounded wrong, like it belonged in another house, another family. My grandfather looked around the table, as if waiting for someone to laugh and say it was a joke. No one did. I'm not sure what you mean, Grandpa said carefully. My father didn't sit back down. He stayed standing, one hand resting on the chair, the other wrapped around his wine glass. I mean, Dad said slowly, that some people reach a point where they're just in the way. My mother shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Uncle Mark stared at his plate. Susan pretended to adjust her napkin. My cousins avoided eye contact altogether. That silence, that collective decision not to intervene, felt heavier than any shout. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. Grandpa nodded once, as if absorbing something painful but familiar. I've never tried to be in anyone's way, he said. I came because Harper asked me to. Every eye turned toward me. My father followed their gaze and frowned. You invited him? Yes, I said, my voice trembling but steady enough to carry. He's family. Dad let out a short, humorless laugh. That's debatable. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Dad, I said, you don't get to talk about him like that. He turned fully toward me now, irritation flashing across his face. This is between adults, Harper. You always make things emotional. Emotional. That word again. Grandpa reached for his glass of water, his hand shaking slightly as he lifted it. He took a small sip, then set it down with care. I don't want to cause trouble, he said softly. If my presence is a problem, I can leave. My chest tightened. No, I said immediately. You're not leaving, my father scoffed. See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You turn everything into drama. Uncle Mark cleared his throat. Maybe we should all calm down, he muttered, not looking at anyone. But it was too late. Dad shook his head, pacing slightly behind his chair. I work hard to keep this family afloat. I plan, I sacrifice, and then we're expected to carry people who never prepared for anything. He stopped directly behind Grandpa. You've lived your whole life without thinking ahead, Dad continued. No savings, no assets, no backup plan. And now what? We're supposed to feel sorry for you? Grandpa looked up at him, eyes clouded with disbelief. You don't know what I've planned, he said quietly. Dad laughed again. Oh, I think we do. You're still living in that rundown house, still wearing the same old clothes. That tells me everything. The words landed like quiet blows, each one stripping away dignity, piece by piece. I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. Stop, I said. This is cruel. My mother finally spoke, her voice thin and strained. Richard, please, it's Christmas. He waved her off without looking at her. Christmas doesn't change reality. Then he looked down at Grandpa, his expression hardening into something cold and final. You know what hurts the most? Dad said. That you've always acted like you're better than us. Like simplicity makes you superior. Grandpa frowned. I've never... You sit there judging us, Dad continued, while contributing nothing, taking up space, taking up time. That was when Grandpa stood up. Slowly, carefully, with dignity. I've never judged you, he said. I'm proud of you. I always have been. The room felt like it was closing in. Dad stared at him for a moment, then reached into his pocket. At first, I thought he was grabbing his phone. Instead, he pulled out his wallet. My stomach dropped. He flipped it open, rifled through it briefly, and pulled out a folded $10 bill. My breath caught in my throat. This should help, he said flatly. He tossed it onto the table. The bill slid across the polished wood and came to rest near Grandpa's plate. Take it, Dad said. And go. You've embarrassed us enough. The sound of the bill hitting the table echoed in my head. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor. Are you serious? I shouted. That's disgusting. No one looked at me. Grandpa stared at the money, his face pale but composed. Slowly, he reached down and picked it up, not because he needed it, but because leaving it there felt worse. I didn't come for money, he said quietly. I came because I thought this was still my family. My father crossed his arms. Family doesn't mean obligation. I felt tears sting my eyes, not just for Grandpa but for myself. For the years I'd stayed quiet. For every time silence had been mistaken for agreement. This is wrong, I said, my voice shaking. You're humiliating him. Dad turned toward me sharply. If you can't handle the truth, Harper, maybe you should leave too. The room spun. Grandpa looked at me, pain and apology mixed in his eyes. It's okay, he said gently. I don't want you caught in the middle. But I was already in the middle. I'm not staying somewhere he's treated like this, I said. Dad pointed toward the front door. Then go. The word echoed louder than I expected. I helped Grandpa put on his coat. His hands trembled as he slipped his arms into the sleeves. No one stood up. No one followed. No one said a word. As we walked toward the door, the Christmas lights blurred through my tears. At the threshold, Grandpa paused. Merry Christmas, he said softly. The door closed behind us. Cold air rushed in, sharp and unforgiving. Snow crunched beneath our shoes as we stepped onto the porch. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself, my chest aching. I'm so sorry, I whispered. I should have stopped it sooner. Grandpa placed a hand on my shoulder. You did stop it, he said quietly. You just didn't know it yet. I didn't understand what he meant. All I knew was that something irreversible had just happened. Christmas dinner was over, and whatever came next would change everything. We didn't speak much after we left my parents' house. The snow had started falling harder, soft flakes landing on the dark pavement as Grandpa and I walked slowly toward my car. The Christmas lights along the street blinked cheerfully, completely unaware of what had just happened inside that house. I unlocked the car with shaking hands. Grandpa settled into the passenger seat, placing his coat carefully on his lap, as if nothing had happened. That calm scared me more than anger ever could. I shouldn't have let it go that far, I said once we were on the road. My voice cracked. I should have stopped him sooner. Grandpa looked out the window, watching the lights blur past. Harper, he said gently. Some things need to be seen clearly before they can be stopped. I didn't riposte, I swallowed. But it hurt you. Yes, he said. And now I know exactly how much. We drove in silence for a while. Every red light felt too long. Every familiar street felt unfamiliar. When we reached my small apartment, I insisted he stay with me for the night. He didn't argue. Inside, I made tea while he sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the mug, steam rising slowly between us. You don't have to explain anything, I said quietly. But why didn't you ever say something before? Why let them talk to you like that? Grandpa smiled faintly. Not amused, just tired. Because I wanted to believe they cared about me, he said. Not about what I had, just me. The words landed heavily. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed everything: my father's voice, the $10 bill, the way no one intervened. I kept thinking about how easily they dismissed him once they decided he had nothing left to offer. The next morning was Christmas Day. My phone buzzed non-stop, missed calls from my mother. A long message from my Aunt Susan about misunderstandings. A short, sharp text from my father. "We'll talk later." I didn't respond. Instead, Grandpa and I packed quietly. He had plans, he said. Christmas weekend plans. That was when I realized something strange. "Where are you staying?" I asked. "At the hotel downtown," he replied casually. I paused. "The one Dad was bragging about?" "Yes." I frowned. "How did you book that? It's expensive." Grandpa met my eyes, his gaze steady. "I told you," he said softly. "You don't know everything about my plans." We arrived at the hotel just after noon. It was stunning tall glass windows, polished floors, a lobby that smelled faintly of pine and coffee. Guests moved through the space in elegant coats, laughter low and controlled. As we stepped inside, something unexpected happened. The front desk agent looked up and immediately stood. "Good afternoon, Mr. Collins," he said respectfully. "Welcome back." Grandpa nodded. "Thank you." The agent didn't ask for identification, didn't ask for a reservation number. He simply typed for a moment, then gestured toward the elevators. "Your suite is ready," he said. "If you need anything at all, please let us know." I stared. As we walked away, I leaned closer to Grandpa. "Do you come here often?" He smiled but didn't answer. Upstairs, the room overlooked the city. Large windows, soft lighting. Everything about it whispered quiet authority. I set my bag down slowly. "Grandpa," I said carefully, "why does everyone here seem to know you?" He took off his coat and hung it neatly by the door. "Because this place has been part of my life for a long time." That was all he said. Later that afternoon, my family arrived. I watched from a distance as they entered the lobby, my father walking confidently, my mother smiling politely, my uncle and cousins chatting like nothing had happened the night before. Then they saw Grandpa. The shift was immediate. Confusion flickered across my father's face. My mother slowed her steps. My aunt whispered something under her breath. I heard Dad mutter, "What is he doing here?" Before anyone could approach us, the hotel manager stepped forward. "Mr. Collins," he said warmly, extending a hand. "It's good to see you." Grandpa shook it. "Merry Christmas." The manager turned toward my family. "May I help you with something?" Dad straightened. "Yes, we're checking in." The manager nodded politely, then glanced back at Grandpa. "Of course," he said. "Everything has been arranged." My father frowned. "Arranged by who?" The manager hesitated, then smiled. "By Mr. Collins." The silence that followed was sharp. My father laughed nervously. "That's funny." The manager didn't laugh. I felt my heart start to race. That was when I realized the truth wasn't going to come out in a dramatic speech. It was going to surface quietly. In looks, in reactions, in the way power shifts when people realize they've misjudged someone completely. My father opened his mouth to speak again. But before he could, the manager turned to Grandpa and said, calmly and clearly, "Sir, would you like us to proceed as discussed?" Grandpa nodded. "Yes," he said. "It's time." I looked at him, my pulse pounding. "Time for what?" I whispered. He met my eyes, his expression steady and resolved. "For them to understand," he said quietly, "that dignity doesn't disappear just because someone chooses to live simply." And as my family stood there, waiting still unaware of what was about to be revealed, I knew one thing for certain. The night before had been humiliation, but what was coming next was accountability. The hotel lobby felt different once my family arrived. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic, but the air shifted, thick with confusion and unease, like the moment right before a storm breaks. My father stood stiffly near the front desk, his confident posture from earlier already slipping. My mother smoothed her coat again and again, forcing a polite smile that no longer reached her eyes. Uncle Mark whispered something to Aunt Susan, both of them glancing back at Grandpa as if he might vanish if they stopped looking. He didn't. Grandpa stood calmly beside me, hands folded in front of him, his old coat still on. He looked exactly the same as he had the night before, quiet, composed, unremarkable at first glance, and yet, every staff member who passed us nodded respectfully in his direction. My father noticed. "Why are they staring at him like that?" he muttered under his breath. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding too loudly. The hotel manager returned, his expression professional but firm. "Mr. Collins," he said to Grandpa, Everything is prepared. My father stepped forward immediately. Prepared for what? The manager looked at him, then back at Grandpa, as if carefully choosing his words. For the changes you requested, sir. The word changes landed heavily. My father let out a sharp laugh. This is ridiculous. He doesn't get to make changes here. He's not. Richard, Grandpa said quietly. My father froze. It was the first time Grandpa had spoken his name directly. You raised your voice at me last night, Grandpa continued, his tone steady, not angry. You told me to leave. You made it clear that, to you, I was a burden. My father's jaw tightened. You embarrassed us. Grandpa nodded slowly. Yes. And now you understand how that feels. The lobby had gone almost completely silent. Even the guests nearby had paused, pretending not to listen while listening to every word. The manager cleared his throat. Sir, he said to my father, Mr. Collins is the owner of this property. The sentence didn't sound dramatic. It didn't need to. It dropped into the space between us like a stone into still water. My mother inhaled sharply. Uncle Mark took a step back. Susan whispered, That's not possible. My father stared at the manager, then at Grandpa, his face draining of color. That's not funny, Dad said. This is some kind of joke. The manager remained calm. It's not a joke, sir. Mr. Walter Collins has been the owner of this hotel for over 5 years. 5 years. The number echoed in my head. 5 years of silence. 5 years of watching. 5 years of listening. My father's voice dropped. You live in that old house. I live simply because I choose to, Grandpa interrupted gently. Not because I have to. My mother found her voice then, trembling. Walter, why didn't you tell us? Grandpa looked at her for a long moment. I wanted to know who cared about me, he said, and who cared about what I had. No one spoke. The truth stretched out between us, undeniable and sharp. My father straightened suddenly, panic flickering behind his eyes. Well, if that's the case, he said quickly, then there's been a misunderstanding. Last night got out of hand. We were all emotional. Grandpa didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the manager. Please proceed. The manager nodded and gestured subtly. 2 security staff approached not aggressively, not loudly. Just present. Mr. Miller, the manager said. Your reservation has been canceled. All charges will be refunded. However, Mr. Collins has requested that you and your party leave the premises today. My father's face turned red. You can't do this, he snapped. We're family. Grandpa met his gaze. Family doesn't treat someone as disposable. My cousin stared at the floor. My aunt pressed her lips together, tears forming but never falling. This isn't revenge, Grandpa continued. It's boundaries. I felt something inside me loosen years of tension, years of silence. My mother stepped toward him. We didn't mean it, she said softly. You know that. Grandpa shook his head. No, he said. You didn't think it mattered. Security waited patiently. One by one, my family gathered their things, their movements stiff and hurried. Conversations were hushed, faces turned away from us. The confidence they'd carried into the lobby earlier was gone, replaced by something smaller, fragile. As they walked past me, my father stopped. You planned this, he said to me quietly. Didn't you? I met his eyes. No, I said. I just refused to stay silent. He said nothing else. When the lobby doors closed behind them, the space felt lighter, quieter, like it could breathe again. I turned to Grandpa, my hands trembling slightly. Why? I asked softly. Why let it go that far? He looked tired but peaceful. Because people reveal their true selves when they believe there are no consequences, he said. And because I needed you to see it too. The manager approached again. Sir, he said respectfully, would you like to return to your suite? Grandpa nodded. As we walked toward the elevators, I glanced back at the entrance one last time. Christmas lights reflected faintly on the glass doors. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering footprints almost as soon as they appeared. What happens now? I asked quietly. Grandpa placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Now, he said, we protect what matters. And for the first time since that disastrous dinner, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. The hotel suite felt unnaturally quiet after everything that had happened. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows, distant and indifferent, as if nothing had shifted at all. But inside me, something had changed permanently. I sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded tightly in my lap, replaying the moment my family had been asked to leave. Not shouted at, not humiliated, just removed. With dignity. Grandpa poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to me. "You did well," he said softly. I shook my head. "I didn't do anything," he smiled. "Exactly." We sat in silence for a few moments before I finally asked the question that had been weighing on me since the lobby. "What happens now?" Grandpa set his cup down carefully. "Now," he said, "we put things in writing." The next morning, we met with his attorney, David Reynolds, in a private conference room overlooking the river. David was calm, precise, and respectful in a way that made it clear this wasn't his first time dealing with complicated families. "I've been advising Mr. Collins for several years," he explained as he arranged documents neatly on the table. "What happened last night didn't create new decisions. It confirmed existing ones." My chest tightened. Grandpa nodded. "I wanted Harper here," he said. "She deserves transparency." David slid a folder toward me. Inside were estate documents, trusts, and legal protections structured, intentional, and thorough. "Your grandfather made arrangements long before last night," David continued. "Not out of fear, but foresight." I looked at Grandpa, stunned. "You planned all this?" "I planned for fairness," he replied gently. "Not forgiveness." David explained how Grandpa had separated personal relationships from business assets. The hotel, investments, and properties were placed under carefully managed entities, shielded from emotional decisions and family pressure. "And regarding inheritance," David added, "Mr. Collins updated his will months ago." My heart pounded. "None of your family members who engaged in repeated emotional mistreatment are listed as beneficiaries," he said calmly. "This was done legally, ethically, and with clear documentation." I thought of my mother's forced smile, my father's voice telling Grandpa to leave. "The $10 bill. They can't challenge this?" I asked. "They can try," David replied. "But the law doesn't reward entitlement, it recognizes intent." Grandpa placed a hand over mine. "I didn't want to punish anyone," he said. "I wanted to protect myself. And you." The word protect echoed. For the first time, I understood this wasn't about wealth. It was about safety. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Harper," she said quickly, her voice strained. "We need to talk." "I don't think there's anything left to say," I replied calmly. She sighed. "Your father didn't mean it the way it sounded." I closed my eyes. "Mom," I said, "he told Grandpa to leave. He threw money at him, and no one stopped it." Silence. "We were under stress," she finally said. "So was he," I replied. "Every day." Her voice softened. "You don't understand what this is doing to the family." "I do," I said. "I finally do." When the call ended, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Later that evening, Grandpa and I walked slowly along the river. The cold air bit at our cheeks, but neither of us rushed. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "I regret how long I waited." I stopped walking. "Why me?" He turned toward me. "Because when everyone else stayed quiet," he said, "you stood up. Not for money, not for recognition, for dignity." Tears blurred my vision. "I was scared," I admitted. "So was I," he said. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing not to let fear decide." Over the next few days, the fallout spread quietly. Emails from relatives. Messages that shifted from anger to guilt to bargaining. David handled everything. "Direct communication isn't advised," he told me gently. "Boundaries are part of healing." Grandpa agreed. We spent Christmas simply, no crowds, no performance. Just meals cooked slowly, conversations without tension, and long silences that felt peaceful instead of heavy. On Christmas night, Grandpa looked at me across the table. "Whatever comes next," he said, "you won't face it alone." I nodded, finally understanding the weight of those words. Because the truth was, my family hadn't lost a fortune that Christmas. They'd lost access, to control, to entitlement, to someone they'd never truly seen. And as I looked at my grandfather calm, resolute, protected by both law and conscience, I realized something profound. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it arrives as clarity, and once you see clearly, there's no going back. The messages didn't stop after Christmas. At first, they came cautiously short emails from relatives who hadn't spoken up at dinner but now wanted to check in. Then the tone changed. Apologies appeared. Explanations. Long paragraphs about misunderstandings and stress, and how no one meant for things to go that far. I read them all. I just didn't respond. A week later, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. I stood frozen behind the door, hand hovering over the handle, my heart pounding as if I were about to relive the same night all over again. When I finally opened it, my mother stepped forward with a tired smile that looked rehearsed. "Harper," she said softly. "We need to talk." My father stood behind her, hands shoved into his coat pockets, his posture stiff and unfamiliar. I didn't invite them in. We stood there in the hallway, the hum of the elevator filling the silence. "I'm listening," I said. My mother's smile wavered. "Can we come inside?" "No," I replied gently. "Say what you came to say." My father cleared his throat. "We didn't know," he began. "About your grandfather. About the hotel. About any of it." I looked at him steadily. "That's not what hurt him." He frowned. "Then what did?" "The way you treated him when you thought he had nothing," I said. "That wasn't confusion. That was choice." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We were overwhelmed. You know how holidays are." "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." My father shifted uncomfortably. "We're still family." I took a breath. This was the moment I'd been dreading and preparing for. "Family doesn't throw money at someone and tell them to leave," I said. "Family doesn't stay silent while that happens." Silence fell between us. My mother reached out slightly, then stopped herself. He's changed," she said. Distant. "No," I replied. "He's protected." That word again. My father looked away. "We just want things to go back to normal." I felt something inside me settle. Normal, I said, was him being hurt quietly. Normal was me staying silent so everyone else could stay comfortable. I don't want that back. My mother wiped her eyes. "So, that's it? You're cutting us off?" I shook my head. "I'm setting boundaries." They left shortly after, without yelling, without drama, and somehow, that hurt more than the fight ever had. It felt final. That night, I walked along the river alone, replaying everything in my mind. I expected guilt, doubt, regret. What I felt instead was grief for the family I'd hoped we could be, and the one we never were. The next day, my cousins tried a different approach. Messages that sounded casual. "Miss you, we should grab coffee. No hard feelings, right?" I didn't answer. Grandpa noticed the weight I was carrying. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said one evening as we sat in his suite, the city lights flickering outside. "I don't want to be cruel," I admitted. "I just don't want to be pulled back into something that hurts." "That's wisdom," he replied gently. A few days later, we attended a small gathering hosted by one of Grandpa's longtime friends. People greeted him warmly, with respect that wasn't performative or conditional. They asked about his health, his thoughts, his opinions. No one treated him like a burden. I watched him laugh, really laugh for the first time in a long while. And I realized something that surprised me. This was his real family. Not bound by blood, bound by choice. On the drive home, Grandpa was quiet. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "I was just thinking about timing." "Timing? I waited too long to protect myself," he said. "I won't make that mistake again." I nodded. "Neither will I." That week, David called to update us on legal matters. Everything was proceeding smoothly. No challenges, no surprises. "Your boundaries are holding," he said. "That's not always easy." After the call, Grandpa looked at me thoughtfully. "Harper," he said, "there will always be people who confuse access with entitlement. You don't owe them either." I smiled faintly. I know. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because whatever future waited for me, whether it included reconciliation or permanent distance, I would meet it without shrinking. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance my grandfather could give me. Spring arrived quietly that year. The snow melted from the sidewalks. The city softened. And with it, so did something inside me that I hadn't realized had been clenched for decades. Life didn't return to normal, but it became honest. Grandpa Walter moved permanently into a smaller residence connected to one of his properties, not because he needed to, but because he wanted simplicity with support. He still wore the same old sweaters, still drank black coffee every morning, still waved politely at strangers like the world was fundamentally kind. But now, he was protected. Legally, emotionally, deliberately. I stayed close. Not as a caretaker, but as family, real family. We cooked together. We took slow walks. Sometimes we talked about the past. Sometimes we didn't need to. One afternoon, as we sat by the window watching people hurry by below, Grandpa said something I'll never forget. "People think power changes you," he said. "But it doesn't. It just gives you the chance to stop pretending." I understood exactly what he meant. My parents stopped calling after a while. Not dramatically, not angrily. They simply faded. Occasionally, I heard updates through distant relatives. They were struggling, not financially, emotionally. The narrative they'd built for themselves no longer held. They weren't victims. They weren't misunderstood. They were accountable. And accountability, I learned, feels unbearable to people who've never faced it before. I didn't celebrate that. But I didn't mourn it either. One evening, months later, Grandpa asked me to join him for dinner at the hotel restaurant, the same place where everything had shifted. We sat at a quiet table near the window. No spectacle, no attention, just food, soft music, and calm. As we finished dessert, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. "I want you to have this," he said. Inside was a handwritten letter. Not about money. Not about property. About values. He wrote about dignity. About silence. About how kindness should never require permission. About how standing up for someone even once can change the course of a life. At the bottom, he'd written, "What I leave you isn't wealth. It's clarity. Use it well." I folded the letter carefully and held it close. That night, as we left the restaurant, a young staff member held the door open for Grandpa and said warmly, "Good evening, sir." Grandpa smiled and thanked him, not because he owned the place, but because that's who he was. And in that moment, I realized the truth my family never understood. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned by how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter. The Christmas dinner that shattered my family also rebuilt me. It taught me that silence can be mistaken for consent, that love without boundaries becomes harm, and that protecting someone doesn't always mean fighting loudly. Sometimes it means standing firm and refusing to move. I used to believe family was something you endured. Now I know better. Family is something you choose to protect. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop shrinking, stop excusing, and finally say, "This is where it ends."